Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are taking a single catastrophic event from November 1970, a storm known as the Great Bhola Cyclone,
Mm,
and proving why it wasn't just, a horrific natural disaster, but arguably the most critical and unexpected political shockwave of that entire decade.
right.
It fundamentally led to the birth of a nation.
That's really where the power of this analysis lies. The Bhola Cyclone, it stands as one of the deadliest disasters ever recorded in human history. We're talking well over 300,000 people killed.
And some estimates are even higher, right?
Oh, alarmingly higher.
Mhm.
Some historical estimates push that figure closer to maybe 500,000. But the core mission of this deep dive isn't just the tragedy itself. It's to analyze how this environmental catastrophe was instantly transformed into a political and social flashpoint.
I see.
An event that directly led to the independence of Bangladesh in 1971 and really fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape of South Asia.
And our sources for this deep dive are truly fascinating because they let us connect the meteorological facts directly to human action.
Yeah, that's what's so powerful here.
We aren't just relying on, emotional testimony, though that's obviously vital. We are diving into hard academic research that combines modern analysis of newly uncovered satellite imagery and digitized voting records
Right.
with these detailed historical disaster management reports and contemporary climate science focusing on the Bay of Bengal.
It's an incredible stack of material. It provides a kind of precision we often lack in historical disaster analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand the political fallout, you first have to recognize the context. This cyclone struck the coast of what was then East Pakistan.
Okay.
And the thing is, this disaster didn't create the deep structural fault lines between East and West Pakistan. Those resentments have been accumulating for years. But the storm exposed them. It made state failure visible, legible, and for the leadership in West Pakistan, fatally impossible to ignore.
So let's frame our discussion for you, the listener. We're starting with the sheer physical terror and the geography of the storm itself. Then we're moving quickly through the political explosion it triggered, which fundamentally changed governance. And then we'll end with what lessons Bangladesh has learned about resilience in the 50-plus years since.
And critically, why the future of climate change threatens to undo all of that incredible progress.
Exactly. This is not just a weather story. This is a story about trust, governance, and the revolutionary power of a common catastrophe.
So to begin, we really need to set the stage for the immense violence this storm inflicted.
Starting with the storm's physical power. So Bola struck the coast of East Pakistan in November of 1970, and it hit with just brutal intensity. Give us the basic meteorological profile.
Well, the Great Bhola Cyclone reached a peak intensity equivalent to a powerful Category 3 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale.
Okay, a Cat 3.
Yeah, so that means sustained, devastating winds clocked around 185 kilometers per hour, or roughly 115 miles per hour.
That alone is deadly.
Oh, absolutely. That's enough to strip trees, destroy lightly built structures.
Yeah.
But as you alluded to earlier, the wind, that was only part of the story.
This is where the geography comes in. I think a lot of people hear cyclone or hurricane and they just think of wind damage.
Right.
But the real horror in the Bay of Bengal is almost always the water.
Absolutely. The location at the head of the Bay of Bengal creates this legal natural mechanism. The bay is shallow, and it's shaped like a funnel.
A funnel?
Yeah, it's almost specifically designed to trap and amplify storm surges. Experts call it a storm surge amplifier. As the cyclone pushed the ocean water toward the coast, that V-shape funneled the massive volume of water, and it prevented it from dissipating.
So it just piles up.
It piles up, exactly. And what was the result of that funneling effect in November 1970?
What are we looking at?
The resulting storm surges were just catastrophic. Reports indicated the surge was over 10 meters.
10 meters.
That's 33 feet high in some areas. So imagine a wall of water taller than a 3-story building sweeping inland, moving at high velocity.
Unbelievable. And this swept across the Ganges Delta Islands, which are already low-lying.
Right. Places like Bhola, Hatia, and Manpura, which sit only marginally above sea level even on a calm day, they stood no chance.
The surges paint a terrifying picture of the scale of human loss. We often talk about death tolls as these abstract numbers, but what do the reports say about the localized impact?
I mean, the scale of loss, it really defies easy comprehension. Over 300,000 people died, making it possibly the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded globally.
Wow.
And the sources are very specific about the localized devastation. For instance, the Tazamuddin area was the most severely affected subdistrict. Of its total population of 167,000 people, Nearly 47% were killed.
47%, that's half a town.
Essentially half a town wiped out in a single night.
Just gone. And of course, the economic devastation just mirrored the human toll.
Completely. It wasn't just lives lost. It was, the entire foundation of life was destroyed.
The foundation, right.
The sources noted that in Tazumuddin, all standing rice crops were destroyed. In the broader Barisal region, which is a major agricultural hub, around 35% of the vital rice crops were wiped out.
So instant famine conditions.
Instantly. Millions lost their homes, their fishing boats, their entire means of income in a few short hours. This created a humanitarian crisis on a massive scale overnight.
And the sources emphasize this. They say the death toll was extremely higher compared to later storms of similar meteorological strength. So why? What was different?
Because it highlighted a profound lack of basic preparedness infrastructure. It wasn't merely a natural event. It was a societal vulnerability laid bare.
What do you mean by that?
There were very few seawalls, inadequate warning systems, and crucially, an almost total absence of strong, concrete cyclone shelters capable of protecting large populations. This lack of investment, it immediately points to the political context of really structural neglect.
And this neglect leads us directly into the political landscape. East and West Pakistan were already in a state of high tension. So the disaster strikes a society that's already suffering from decades of this institutional imbalance.
That's the critical undercurrent. Grievances have been accumulating for years. The political capital, the military power, it all rested entirely in West Pakistan. Yet East Pakistan was the economic engine.
And how staggering was that economic disparity? Can you give us some hard numbers to illustrate the scale of that extraction?
The disparity was, well, it was astonishing. East Pakistan accounted for a large share of the country's export earnings, primarily through the highly valuable jute trade.
Okay, so they're making the money.
They are making the money. But despite earning a massive portion of the national wealth, West Pakistan, the seat of central power, captured over 70% of the government's entire budget for development and public works.
70%. So East Pakistan was generating the wealth, but West Pakistan was controlling all the investment, the infrastructure spending, the bureaucratic power. It sounds like a classic colonial extraction model, but happening inside a single state.
Precisely. This structural imbalance was pervasive. Military command, the top ranks of the civil service, public investment in everything from roads to hospitals, overwhelmingly dominated by West Pakistanis.
And that must have created this profound, sustained sense of disenfranchisement.
Oh, absolutely. In the East, citizens felt they were paying the bills but had no voice, no power, and critically, no protection.
And the timing of the cyclone couldn't have been worse for the central regime.
No. This already simmering cauldron of resentment just boiled over because the cyclone hit just weeks before the pivotal December 1970 national elections.
Which were the first free and fair national elections in Pakistan's history.
Exactly. So the stage was set for the deepest fault lines to be exposed to the world. A massive natural disaster was about to become an unprecedented political weapon.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting and complex. The Awami League, the party pushing for autonomy in East Pakistan, was widely predicted to win the election overwhelmingly anyway. So how can we be sure the cyclone didn't just, reinforce existing loyalty, but that it truly accelerated the path to revolution, as these studies suggest?
That's an excellent, critical question. The core finding of the academic studies is that the disaster acted as a mechanism of political coordination under duress.
A mechanism of coordination.
Exactly. It wasn't about changing the overall outcome. It was about broadening the mandate, deepening the conviction, and providing the organizing structure for the armed resistance that came later.
And the catalyst for that mechanism was the central government's response, or lack thereof.
Yes. The key factor was profound state indifference. The central government's reaction was widely perceived as late, insufficient, and just tragically absent. And this indifference, it wasn't just a feeling. It was immediately contrasted with international action. We have documentation that international relief flights from major global organizations arrived within days.
Within days.
Yeah.
But the aid from West Pakistan, the government that's supposedly responsible for these citizens.
It was delayed, it was minimal, and in many crucial storm-battered coastal areas, it was entirely absent in that vital first week.
The first week.
Reports documented a significant supply bottleneck, with relief supplies piled up far away from the Delta coast, either unable or unwilling to be transported to the hardest-hit islands.
And that absence, in a moment of just existential crisis, must have carried this devastating political weight.
It carried profound political meaning. You have to imagine survivors were literally waiting in salt water and mud, starving, watching international aid arrive while their own central government did nothing. This confirmed, beyond any doubt, the deeply held belief in East Pakistan that they were governed by a distant elite that extracted their wealth, but fundamentally failed to protect their lives, their dignity, or their safety. This was the ultimate betrayal.
This sounds like the moment the political crisis became, as you said, legible, not just to political intellectuals, but to every farmer and fisherman.
Precisely. The political contrast became instantly legible to every single voter preparing for that December election. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, immediately suspended its regular campaign rallies and focused entirely on relief.
So they shifted their whole operation.
The whole thing. They organized their own local efforts, sending boats with supplies and food into the inundated communities before the central government even mobilized.
So for the voters, you're giving them a real-time life-or-death test of governance. Who showed up when the water was rising? The remote, absent central government or the local movement showing solidarity and delivering aid?
And the answer was overwhelming. The electoral fallout was statistically measurable. The modern academic analysis, using that digitized data, confirmed that the areas hardest hit by storm intensity gave the Awami League significantly more votes. The storm galvanized the base.
And what was the magnitude of that shift? Was it a huge jump?
Well, the Awami League was already favored to win and ultimately won 160 of 162 seats in East Pakistan, so it was a landslide. But the cyclone acted as a final nudge, increasing their vote share in East Pakistan from roughly 74% to approximately 78%.
So that 4 percentage point nudge, it might seem small in a landslide, but what you're saying is it broadened the mandate. It deepened the support for self-rule and the complete rejection of West Pakistani authority.
Exactly. The election provided this overwhelming political mandate for self-rule. But when the military regime predictably refused to transfer power after that victory, the crisis escalated from the polling booth to open conflict. This is that critical transition from ballots to the battlefield.
Right.
Yes. And this is where the precision of the data is just stunning. We have a historical registry of the 206,000 recognized freedom fighters who joined the guerrilla movement, the Mukti Bahini.
And you can map where they came from.
You can map their birthplaces, and it offers stunning evidence of the cyclone's catalytic role in generating resistance.
So what did that geographical mapping reveal?
It showed that volunteers were disproportionately drawn from the sub-districts that had experienced the most intense storm damage and, crucially, the weakest governmental relief. The correlation is crystal clear. Where the storm was fiercest and the state's failure was most acute, the revolutionary conviction was strongest.
That's incredible. So the same variation in cyclone intensity that marginally raised the Awami League's vote share also increased insurgent participation by about 21%.
Correct. And that translates to roughly 260 additional volunteers per electoral district, directly linked to the trauma and neglect caused by Bhola. The sheer volume of new recruits from the hardest-hit regions immediately following the crisis provided the human power needed for a sustained armed resistance.
Let's dig into that mechanism you mentioned earlier. How exactly does a collective trauma like this translate into organized tactical action?
The cyclone achieved two critical things that are necessary for a revolution. First, it made grievances common knowledge and morally legible. Before the cyclone, resentment was, localized and structural. After Bhola, every single person knew the state didn't care about the lives of East Pakistanis. This shared moral outrage created a unified conviction.
Okay, so everyone's on the same page.
Everyone's on the same page.
Okay.
And second, the Awami League's relief efforts provided the immediate pre-existing local networks that could then channel that widespread anger into organized resistance and recruitment.
So state failure provided the conviction, and the Awami League provided the existing infrastructure, the boats, the organizers, the trusted local figures, to turn that conviction into battalions of volunteers.
Exactly. That surge of popular support and the willingness of people to fight bought critical time. It sustained the movement through the initial military crackdown until India's intervention in December 1971 brought the conflict to a decisive close and established Bangladesh. Bhola didn't just precipitate the war, it structurally fueled the resistance movement that made independence possible.
And the sources remind us this mechanism isn't a unique historical accident.
Not at all. We see powerful historical parallels where a climate shock or a natural disaster serves as the trigger for profound political change. Think of the 1978 Tabbas earthquake in Iran. followed by the Shah's notably inadequate response, which is widely believed to have fueled the subsequent 1979 revolution, or even the devastating 1943 Bengal famine, which was deepened by deliberate British wartime policy decisions, and that crystallized anti-colonial sentiment and demands for self-rule.
So the pattern is undeniable. The core question forced upon the population by these events is always the same, right?
Always. If the state cannot protect us, if it allows us to starve or drown when we are most vulnerable, what claim does it have on our loyalty? Bhola gave the people of East Pakistan an immediate, highly personal, and universally shared answer. None.
So once the political dust settled and the nation of Bangladesh was born, the very nature of these catastrophes became subject to this intense philosophical and political debate. It's the inherent dichotomy we see globally after massive events. Was this an inevitable act of nature, or was it an avoidable human failure?
This is a fundamental debate, and it really speaks to where political accountability is placed. This philosophical divide became excruciatingly clear not just after 1970, but again after the 1991 cyclone, which also resulted in a horrifying death toll of nearly 140,000 people.
And the response from the national government often sought to define the catastrophe as purely natural, trying to minimize state responsibility.
Correct. The official Bangladeshi position, you see it frequently in government statements and local media, it emphasized the natural origins and the inevitability of disasters. Prime Minister Begum Khalida, speaking later, stated that Bangladesh would have to live with natural calamities as it has been a part of our life.
It's a narrative that basically argues the nation is inherently cursed with the worst geography in the world.
Right.
But wait, isn't that just a convenient political excuse to shift focus away from domestic structural issues?
That is precisely the counter-argument mounted by the international and scholarly community. They insist on establishing the important distance that exists between the fact of climatic hazard and disaster.
Okay, break that down. Hazard versus disaster.
The cyclone, the climatic hazard, that may be inevitable, but the ensuing massive death toll and destruction, the disaster, is viewed as a social or political disaster.
So the disaster isn't the wind or the water, it's the structural conditions that allowed those elements to be so destructive.
Exactly. The disaster is seen as resulting from historically increasing socioeconomic vulnerability. The core argument shifts the blame from nature, which is neutral, to structural issues within society itself, which are the product of political and economic choices.
And what do the sources identify as the primary, most devastating structural vulnerability in Bangladesh?
Unquestionably, it's poverty. Scholars argue that throughout the developing world, the poor and the powerless are consistently the closest to natural hazards and are the least equipped to survive them. So their high mortality rates are a direct function of their economic status, not just bad luck with the weather.
How does poverty specifically translate into that reduced adaptive capacity?
Well, poverty systematically erodes adaptive capacity at every level. If you're poor, you can't afford safe building materials for your house, so you live in a shack. You can't afford to repair damage or maintain defenses. Crucially, you can't afford a surplus, a store of grain or cash, to absorb losses like a spoiled harvest or the destruction of a fishing boat.
So any loss is total.
Your loss is instant, total, and often fatal.
I remember this truly arresting and tragic image from one of the reports about the 1991 cyclone rescue workers finding hundreds of dead infants and children tied to uprooted trees.
That image is it's heartbreaking. And it forces us to reflect on the level of desperation. The parents had hoped the trees, usually a tall, flexible variety, would hold against the floodwaters when nothing else would.
And it's easy to look at that and frame the event as the wind and waters being too great, which justifies that narrative of inevitability.
Right. But the scholarly perspective asks a different question.
Which is?
The real tragedy, they point out, is why those people and their families were compelled to live in that hazardous region in the first place. Land scarcity, coupled with immense population pressure, it compels poor farmers to settle in the fertile but extremely hazardous accreted shorelands.
These are the new islands of silt that build up near the coast.
Exactly. So their location is a function of insurmountable socioeconomic variables, not simply irrational behavior or a failure to predict the weather.
So poverty dictates where you must live, and where you live dictates your vulnerability to the natural hazard.
Right.
The hazard becomes a disaster because of the social and economic structure, which means the disaster is avoidable even if the storm isn't.
Exactly. And once you establish this perspective of an unnatural disaster, the debate doesn't just stop at internal structural issues. It often expands the scope of analysis to the entire world, invoking the concepts of global warming and greenhouse gas emissions.
This is where we get into what the sources call disaster diplomacy.
Yes, the focus shifts from domestic reform to international equity. Bangladeshi accounts often link the disaster toll directly to greenhouse gas emissions generated overwhelmingly by industrialized nations. The argument is simple. Industrialized nations are the major producers of climate-altering gases.
But the developing nations, which are geographically and economically vulnerable, suffer the most acute consequences.
It's an explicit call for climate justice. The developing world is bearing the costs of the developed world's emissions. And this thesis is inherently appealing to developing countries like Bangladesh.
And what's the ultimate goal of that diplomacy?
To urge industrialized nations not only to curb their emissions, but also to accept financial responsibility for climate damage and potentially to pay for the adaptation and resilience measures needed in the hardest-hit regions. This framing reallocates the blame globally and turns climate vulnerability into a powerful negotiating tool on the international stage. We need to pull back now and see the massive generational footprint left by the 1970 disaster, which was compounded by the subsequent war and famine that lasted until 1974. The academic research shows that the shock of these events was profound and long-lasting, particularly for cohorts who were exposed in utero or in early childhood.
Why is that specific period exposure in utero or early childhood so critically important in determining long-term outcomes?
Because it hits during the most critical developmental stages. When a pregnant mother or a young child experiences severe trauma, malnutrition, widespread disease outbreaks, all consequences of the cyclone, it leads to immediate health damage that can become permanent.
Okay.
Maternal stress, coupled with resource scarcity and potential famine exposure, it biologically programs the fetus or the infant for long-term health vulnerabilities and cognitive deficits. It can affect growth, brain development, everything.
And this research uses modern econometric methods to trace health and economic outcomes decades later. So what were the specific adversities measured for the people who were infants or in the womb when the 1970 cyclone struck?
The researchers compared the 1969 to 1971 birth cohorts in the severely affected regions, places like Barazal and Noakhali, to control cohorts from less affected areas. And the results are truly stark. They just underscore the persistent nature of this shock.
So give us some of the hard numbers on the health outcomes years later when these individuals are reaching adulthood.
Okay, so in terms of health reported decades later, these cohorts had a 14.9 percentage point lower probability of reporting good health as adults.
Wow.
And even more dramatically, they experienced a massive 53.6% lower duration of good health over their entire lifetime compared to the control group.
Wait, let's translate that. 53.6%, that is a substantial number. What does that mean in practical human terms?
It means that exposure to the trauma, the chaos, the nutritional stress of the 1970 cyclone and the conflict that followed, it didn't just hurt people that year. It effectively stole significant healthy years from their adult lives decades later. They entered adulthood with these underlying vulnerabilities, chronic diseases, lower physical stamina that reduce their ability to work, to earn, and to sustain a healthy life.
And what about the human capital deficit, specifically in terms of education?
The effects on education were equally damaging, just tripling opportunities for an entire generation. These cyclone-exposed cohorts showed a 21.8 percentage points lower probability of completing at least the 5th grade of schooling.
So not even finishing primary school.
Well, not even finishing primary school. Overall, they had 49% lower years of schooling.
And for those born right at the peak of the crisis, the 1969 to 71 cohorts in the cyclone-affected regions, how bad was that educational shortfall?
It was catastrophically bad, 63.8% lower years of schooling. That is a staggering human capital deficit passed down from a single event compounded by the political chaos that followed. I mean, if you didn't finish primary school, your economic opportunities are severely limited for life.
And the economic impact naturally follows that educational deficit.
Exactly. In adulthood, these cohorts showed significantly lower solvency status and therefore lower consumption expenditure. These findings powerfully support the core hypothesis. Childhood exposure to a disaster, especially during critical developmental stages, results in lower health, schooling, and consumption outcomes later in life. It perpetuates a cycle of poverty and vulnerability.
Who within those affected regions suffered the most from these long-term effects? Was the impact felt equally by everyone?
No, not at all. The long-term adverse effects were further heightened among those who were already the most vulnerable. This includes rural agricultural households, those who are less educated before the disaster, and particularly female-headed households, who often have fewer external resources to tap into during a crisis.
So it reinforces the idea that the long-term impact of a disaster depends heavily on your pre-existing socioeconomic status.
The disaster hits the most vulnerable, the hardest, and keeps them vulnerable for generations.
There is a truly puzzling detail here in the research, which the sources call the protective puzzle, and it's about the role of post-disaster assistance.
This is a critical nuance that really challenges our assumptions about aid distribution. The protective puzzle suggests that the primary disaster-affected regions, the absolute geographic epicenter, which receive the most immediate concentrated post-disaster assistance, often bear lower long-term adverse effects than secondary affected regions that might receive less publicized or less focused aid.
Huh. Why would receiving aid in the epicenter lead to better outcomes decades later than in the surrounding regions?
The research suggests it's the quality and the volume of focused, sustained public support. The primary zones, they're often targeted by major international agencies and the government. They receive aid that goes beyond just immediate relief.
So they get long-term investment.
Exactly. They receive long-term investments in rebuilding schools, medical facilities, and sometimes even localized infrastructure projects designed for adaptation. The secondary zones, which suffered significant damage but weren't the photo op epicenter, they received less concentrated support, leaving them to struggle with the generational consequences alone.
So the finding is that recovery isn't just about surviving the storm, it's about the quality and focus of the recovery effort that follows. A massive, targeted intervention can effectively mitigate that generational echo of catastrophe.
It's a powerful argument for the crucial role of targeted, sustained public support in turning a short-term shock into a mitigated long-term consequence. The narrative of Bangladesh's coastal history, it pivots sharply after the structural failure of 1970 and the subsequent shock of 1991. The success story since then is a direct lesson in learning from structural failure and investing in human capital.
And the numbers provide indisputable proof of this learning curve. Let's contrast the historical death toll trend against modern events.
The contrast is staggering. We saw 1970 with 250,000 plus deaths, 1991 with almost 140,000 deaths. Now compare that to later, equally strong or even stronger storms like Cyclone Sidra in 2007.
That was about 10,000 deaths.
Right. And then most recently, Cyclone Iruma in 2024, which recorded only 71 fatalities.
71.
71. That reduction in casualties is just conspicuous, and it demonstrates tangible success in saving hundreds of thousands of lives.
And this improvement is attributed to systematic countermeasures and a philosophical shift in disaster management strategy. Can you define that shift?
The core change was moving away from mere relief and rehabilitation, just giving people rice after the flood, toward proactive risk reduction.
So investing in the seawall so the flood never reaches their door in the first place.
Precisely. And this required a long-term legislative commitment enforced by frameworks like the Disaster Management Act.
Let's look at the supply chain of safety, starting with the most visible infrastructure, the shelters.
Okay, so back in the 1970s, the country had fewer than 100 usable, strong cyclone shelters. They just weren't built to withstand the necessary winds and surges. Today, Bangladesh has completely transformed that infrastructure.
How extensive is the shelter system now?
It's massive. The country now has more than 5,000 concrete, multi-story shelters, many capable of housing nearly 5 million people.
5 million.
They are engineered to withstand winds over 260 kilometers per hour. And importantly, they are not just bunkers, they are multi-purpose. They double as schools and community centers in the off-season, which ensures they remain integrated into community life.
But infrastructure only works if you have a reliable, rapid way to mobilize people into it. And that's where the human network comes in, through the Cyclone Preparedness Program, or CPP.
The CPP, which was established as a direct response to the massive failure of 1970, has become a global model for early warning and mobilization. It relies on community engagement rather than solely on top-down government systems.
And what makes the CPP so effective on the ground?
It's the sheer volume and dedication of the volunteers. They now number more than 76,000.
Wow.
And half of them are women, which is critical for accessing all parts of the community. They're trained to operate at the hyper-local level using simple, effective tools. They use megaphones, often from mosque turrets or local community centers, to spread warnings and usher millions into safety centers. And they frequently accomplish this evacuation in less than 24 hours.
So this community-based social mobilization is deceptively simple, but incredibly effective.
It builds trust and local capacity.
We also have detailed reports on how modern recovery efforts work, like the comprehensive response to Cyclone Remel in 2024. This just shows a huge leap in organizational capacity and philosophical approach compared to the chaotic responses of the past.
Indeed, the response to Ramal, coordinated through organizations like the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society, was complex and holistic. They executed the evacuation of 800,000 people to over 9,000 shelters, which showcases the system's maturity. But recovery went far beyond just temporary shelter.
Tell us about the recovery efforts focused on livelihoods and long-term sustainability.
They focused heavily on cash assistance, which provides dignity and self-determination to the victims. They provided cash for livelihood restoration, around 261 Swiss francs per family, and shelter repair, up to 634 for severely damaged homes, using an owner-driven approach.
An owner-driven approach.
Yeah, this approach empowers communities to lead their own recovery, rather than relying on external agencies to rebuild everything for them.
And what specific measures were taken to address public health and environmental resilience?
The response was comprehensive. It included mobile medical teams for primary care and essential psychosocial support, recognizing the trauma involved. Crucial washwater, sanitation, and hygiene initiatives were implemented. Installing and repairing tube wells, repairing latrines, distributing tens of thousands of liters of safe water, installing rainwater harvesting plants.
And they're thinking about the future, too.
Oh, absolutely. They are integrating green protection by planting over 75,000 saplings in coastal areas, which serves as a natural barrier to future surges.
So the shift toward a comprehensive disaster risk reduction framework is clearly visible in their forward planning, culminating in the ambitious Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100.
That plan is a massive long-term project. It's intended to invest 2.5% of GDP annually to enhance resilience over the next 7 decades. Bangladesh has fundamentally transformed itself from one of the worst sufferers of cyclonic casualties in the world into a world leader in coastal resilience. It demonstrates unequivocally that long-term, focused investments in adaptation can save countless lives and protect economic potential.
Okay, so despite this incredible success story of modern Bangladesh in mitigating disaster casualties, we have to look at the massive elephant in the room. Global climate change is fundamentally reshaping the risk landscape, and it's potentially overwhelming even the most resilient systems.
The warming of the Bay of Bengal is relentless. The sea surface temperature has already risen by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius in the last 45 years. And climate projections show that warming is expected to accelerate, potentially rising further by 2.0 to 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century.
And what is the immediate non-storm related consequence of that warming for this low-lying delta?
Sea level rise. The sea level in the Bay of Bengal is projected to rise 37 centimeters by 2050. That rise alone means higher average inundation levels from tropical cyclones. It makes the current infrastructure less effective because the starting point of the flood is already higher.
Right. And this warming directly impacts the intensity of the storms themselves. What is the consensus among climate scientists about the link between anthropogenic climate change and the ferocity of these tropical cyclones?
The consensus, according to sources like Science Brief, is that climate change is probably increasing the intensity of tropical cyclones. While the frequency might remain stable or even slightly decrease, the intensity, the destructive power, is going up.
And the science behind that is often summarized by the Clausius-Clapeyron relation. Can you explain that in conversational terms?
Certainly. It's a thermodynamic principle that basically tells us warmer air holds more water vapor. For every extra degree Celsius of warming, the air can hold 7% more moisture.
And this moisture is the fuel for these storms.
It's the fuel. More fuel means more power. But critically, it also means much, much more rain.
So heavier rain translates directly into dramatically increased flood risk, regardless of the storm surge itself.
Exactly. Near-storm rainfall rates are projected to increase globally by an average of 14% for a 2 degrees Celsius warming scenario. In a delta region that's already prone to flooding, this exacerbates the risk significantly, potentially overwhelming drainage systems and protective barriers.
And what about the destructive potential of the cyclones? Are we seeing a shift toward more Category 4 and 5 storms?
Yes. The data since 1979 shows an increase in the global average proportion of intense TC occurrence, so Category 3 or higher. Looking forward, the proportion of the most powerful storms, Category 4 and 5, is projected to increase substantially by 24 to 35% under warming.
We are effectively loading the dice toward more catastrophic events.
That's a good way to put it. And we're also seeing more rapid intensification when a storm goes from weak to powerful very quickly, giving far less time for preparation.
Right.
Rapid intensification, defined as an intensity change by more than 18 meters per second in just 24 hours, is projected to become significantly more probable. This is a severe threat to coastal communities because it drastically reduces the already tight window for those CPPP volunteers to mobilize the population into shelters.
And we already have modern warnings of what this supercharged threat looks like. The sources cite the catastrophic effects of the 2025 South and Southeast Asian storms, cyclones Ditwa and Senyar, which killed over 1,800 people across multiple nations.
And studies confirmed these overlapping systems were indeed supercharged by climate change. They exhibited unusual behavior. Ditwa tracked unusually far south, and Senor formed extremely close to the equator.
Which indicates shifting storm tracks.
Shifting storm tracks potentially impacting new areas that have no legacy of resilience, like Bangladesh's central coast has built.
And similar to the 1970 political failures, modern society's ongoing structural failures are compounding the weather events. Rapid urbanization and widespread deforestation were cited as exacerbating factors in those 2025 disasters.
That is the social disaster element reasserting itself. Deforestation removes the sponge effect of natural rainforests and mangroves. These natural systems slow down water runoff and absorb storm surges. When they were removed for development or logging, you get faster runoff, which exacerbates floods and, ironically, increases drought risk in the dry season.
The lesson is clear. The climate crisis is intensifying the natural hazard, while human land use decisions are magnifying the social disaster risk.
Exactly. The Bay of Bengal is witnessing an undeniable increase in cyclone intensity, and the frequency of truly devastating cyclones has shifted alarmingly. Historically, catastrophic storms operated on a 30 to 50-year return period. Now we are seeing intense cyclones strike almost every 8 years.
Wow.
This puts the successful resilience model of Bangladesh under relentless pressure, especially as the risk shifts poleward, potentially impacting new areas that are less well adapted than the coastal regions that have spent decades building that resilience.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize the tragedy of Bhola in 1970 with the resilience of modern Bangladesh and this dire future climate outlook?
The dual lesson is potent, and it's essential for you, the learner, to take away. First, the 1970 cyclone showed that vulnerability is a structural political choice made by states. When a state fails its most basic function, protecting its citizens in a crisis, it loses its legitimacy.
Right.
And that leads to political coordination, revolutionary action, and in this case, the birth of a new nation.
And second, the subsequent history of Bangladesh shows that focused, community-driven investment in resilience, the CPP, the multipurpose shelters, the cash assistance, it can drastically save hundreds of thousands of lives, even against the backdrop of increasing storm frequency and intensity.
However, we are now living in a world where the success of that mitigation is constantly being challenged by the speed of climate change. The long-term threat remains due to increasing storm intensity fueled by global warming. The core lesson remains. The disaster is a social failure, but that failure is increasingly being caused or accelerated by external global factors.
And this brings us back to that profound philosophical debate we touched on earlier, noting that we live in a post-natural world where human society's impact has changed the meaning of nature itself. We have to confront the idea raised by environmental thinkers. The wind still blows, but no longer from some other sphere, some inhuman place.
If the atmosphere itself, the very engine of these storms, is now partly an artifact of human industrial activity, how does this fundamentally change the allocation of responsibility? Not just for immediate disaster relief, we know Bangladesh can manage that better now, but for global equity and climate damage in the future. Who pays the price for the structural failures driven by decisions made thousands of miles away?
And that's our final provocative thought for you to explore. The Great Bhola Cyclone didn't just kill people, it killed a regime. What happens when the next generation of supercharged storms threatens the legitimacy of governance worldwide? What were you most surprised to learn about the deep connection between weather, politics, and fate? We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.